All right, so welcome. Thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk about community because community is just as important as code. And I'm going to go over kind of the history of how this amazing community got started and why it's such a thriving community for so many of us, and then how we can bring those principles of amazing community to the work that we do on our teams and then also for our code bases. All right. When we think about community, I did a stock photo search and this came up. And it's a lot of like hands together and it seems a little like cliche. But then I started thinking about it and was actually like these are actually really good representations of what a community is. And I'll tell you why. A community is a type of system, it's a type of social system. And any system has individuals, interactions, and a purpose. And so here you see individual people, right? They're interacting with each other and they're also celebrating. So that shows that there's some kind of purpose associated with it. But what does that mean, the individual's interactions and purpose? So for individuals, it's like who belongs, who's part of the community, how is that membership determined, where are they, how do we find them, what other communities might they be in where it overlaps, what value do they need, why would they want to join a community, the interactions, what communication infrastructure will be the most supportive, and we'll go over that in a little bit. But like, do we have the actual tools and channels in order for people to facilitate? So like right now using GatherTown, StreamYard, and different things like that. That's an infrastructure that helps us. How can we make our interactions meaningful? And what kind of culture do we have? What goal are we trying to achieve? And then how do we know if the community is healthy? And why do we exist? And what resources do we need to continue being successful? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our origin story, because I think this will give some light on kind of how these ideas of individuals, interactions, and purpose kind of all came together. So Scott, who you just met, Scott and I went to high school together. We've been really good friends since age 11. Like there's pictures of me at his birthday party, right? And we had same classes and teachers. We were both in the marching band. We would nerd out about technology at lunch. Scott was the president of the computer club. My parents were very cutting edge when it came to technology. And we kind of went our ways after high school. So Scott got his degree in computer science. I got my degree in business and marketing. And we kind of went our separate ways. And then in 2009, we reconnected at our 10-year high school reunion. And Scott had an idea for a company called Corgi Bites. He had already founded it, but he was looking for somebody to help with marketing and business. And so he invited me to be the CEO because I had a marketing communication background. And it took us a while to kind of figure out the business model, and we tried a few different things, kind of settled on modernizing legacy code. And through the process of working together, we really liked each other. So we ended up getting married and we started a family. And over the course of those years where we were really building our relationship and figuring out what we wanted to do, we were taking a lot of inspiration from kind of culture, and, we were spending time watching movies together. And there were a couple of things that stood out to me about how Scott identified, both like as an individual, but also in his profession. So the first is this movie Office Space, and it's a cult classic. If you're younger, you may have seen it, but and some of the things might be outdated. But this was so it feels so true. And when I think of menders, there's this feeling. There's this one character. His name's Milton Wadhams, and he is very quiet and has this frustration, and everyone just treats him like he doesn't exist. He's shamed, he's not listened to, he's undervalued. There's a running joke that like he starts in a cubicle and then it gets smaller and then eventually he's in the basement, and they're like, oh, just don't even bother sending him a payroll anymore, but they don't fire him. So he's snubbed, he's ignored. Yeah, I'd like a piece of cake. Yeah. And then the stapler, it's like, don't take my stapler. So when I saw this, like, character, it's like he's doing important work, but everyone is ignoring him, and it's like he's not able to advocate for himself, and he's really treated with a lot of shame and contempt. Like, throughout the movie, a big arc is that the business, the guy who runs, like, the general manager, acts like he's way better than everyone else and treats everybody else. He's, like, got, kind of a control complex. And Milton's brewing resentment ends up, coming out in the end. I won't spoil it in case you haven't seen it. But, this really kind of made me think of, like, how frustrating it was to hear Scott say that he wanted to work on legacy code, but no one really wanted to. And he would talk about, "Hey, we should pay on technical debt, or we should fix bugs." And just feeling like the reaction that he got from people around him kind of felt like this. The other show that really kind of influenced us and we watched a lot is This Old House. And this is very different from other shows about fixer-uppers because it's not about, like, the flip. It's not about the thing that's really fast. It's about valuing history, integrating things that are old with things that are new, and creating that very seamless thing. It's about understanding what the owner needs and delivering that. It's about mastery of a craft, right? They're master carpenters. You learn so much, these little hacks and techniques. Um, they think about the long term, not just the short term. They don't take shortcuts, manage their budget effectively. There's no, like, surprise, you have to come up with $10,000. I mean, sometimes there is because things happen, but for the most part, they try to really have good conversations, not a lot of drama. Um, they preserve things very practically where they can, but sometimes they can't, right? Sometimes they have to throw stuff away, but they really try to preserve what they've got. They're sharing knowledge. It was really about this collective pride, collaboration, communication, and that really stood out as such a different type of home improvement show. And I remember we were sitting on the couch and Scott was like, "I wanna do that." And I was like, "That?" He's like, "Yeah, I was like, "Do you wanna remodel houses?" He's like, "No, that's how I think about legacy code." So another, moment was that I identify as a maker, and so we were walking through Barnes& and Noble, and there was this table set up, and it's like, "Join the maker movement, maker, 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 maker." And this was part when we were kind of still trying to figure out, we hadn't really landed on legacy code being the main thing we were doing. And Scott just stood there feeling really kinda, the interpretation was just kinda, like, sad and kinda like, "Where's my table? There's nothing about mending on here. I don't wanna make anything from scratch. I want to take something that exists," and just feeling very alone. So, taking all of those together as we were, putting together our business and what we were doing, there was just a lot of collaboration, and so we ended up coming up with, a idea for this product life cycle where we had taken, kind of a marketing idea and, kinda started out with, "Here's a linear thing." Scott was like, "No, let's try and make it a circle," and we did, and it was like, "Oh my gosh, making and mending." And so that felt really good. It just felt like, yeah. And through the course of continuing to fill out these models, we had the developer landscape. So looking at making and mending and hacker and craft, similar to the This Old House. And so very clearly it's like, okay, there's rapid prototyping, which I love. Like, let's just get stuff out. But there's also software remodeling, which is really what we felt culturally was kind of missing, which is why Scott didn't feel like he had a place. But when you look at this, it's like, yeah, you do belong. Like, it's part of the whole ecosystem. So we had figured out these things. They were kind of starting to work. And so then in 2015, we went to the Agile 2015 conference. And I know I've seen in Gather Town a few folks who were there and kind of part of this magic. And so Scott presented Old Code, New Tricks, which, is our company tagline, and really showed that there's a lot of value in kind of taking This Old House approach. And it deeply resonated with a lot of people. There was a software, like, craft track. And so there were 15, 20 people who all just like throughout the conference, like we all just nerded out and had lunch together and it felt amazing. And so at the end of the conference, I was like, how are we all going to stay in touch? And someone said, well, community building isn't really our thing. We kind of just have these experiences, but we don't stay in touch throughout the year. And I was like, I can do the communication stuff. Like I can help with that. And it was one of the first times where I actually felt like I belonged. Started we started with the Slack channel. We got a podcast. We put up GitHub for, you know, awesome legacy code and, started a weekly meetup. And it was just very organic. And, over the past, almost 10 years now, it's amazing at what's grown because now for the past 5 years, we've had MenderCon, which is amazing. And I've had to step back a little bit from participating. I feel like kind of my job was to do the making thing and like, let's start something. But so many amazing people have come together to organize. So this is this year's team. Also, Jocelyn and Stephanie, I forgot to put them on there, but they also are a big part of this too. And it's really about celebrating software maintenance. It's about meaningful impact, and we get fantastic feedback about it. So if we look at our community, the individuals here are menders and people who value software maintenance. So even though I'm a maker, I value software maintenance. So being here, like I still belong, right? Interactions, like we've got all those things in MenderCon. And then the purpose, I think, really is about creating a sense of belonging. Like, where's my table? Here's your table, right? And turning shame into celebration. So really noticing that a lot of things that go behind the scenes matter. So we're going to dive into 4 different things that create a sense of belonging that I think we do really well here that, then we can model for the teams that we work on. So the first is feeling understood. And here I want to look at the difference between affinity and empathy. So when we meet with people, sometimes we just feel like, oh my gosh, you get me. And I think that is the feeling that so many people have had in our community. I feel seen. I don't have to like explain myself like I do in all of these other settings. I can just be myself. And that is so, so valuable. And there's a lot of different kind of, you know, properties that you might have. So, people who have the same experience or, they have same knowledge, they think about information in the same way. They consider things to be important, what motivates them, what are they sensitive to, in terms of the details, how much power do they have to make change? How easily do they regulate stress responses? And then also, like, do they have access to different resources? So I think one of the things that has made Legacy Code Rocks really feel like home for a lot of people is there is a sense of affinity. There's a lot of overlap and just a lot of like, you can walk in and feel like, yep, everyone gets me. But the challenge is that if we only stay with the people who think like us, then we don't actually get to the collaboration. So this is where, empathy starts to come in. And if we identify too closely with people who we have a lot of affinity with, then we can end up in trouble. So there's what's called the intergroup empathy bias. And what this means is that a strong affinity, like really identifying and like making this a core part of your identity, and then you can other people. And that can actually mute your empathy. And you start to think of them more like objects or like not think of their feelings. And you increase the empathy that you have for the people who are like you. So this is something to pay attention to. It can absolutely be avoided if we don't other. So if we don't do the like versus. So a lot of times we see this as the business, right? And they're evil, And I think that's, for me, like I come from a business of a very different background. So sometimes I feel like I might be perceived that way just because that's my background. So we think of a broader team. So we think of ourselves as an affinity group within a broader system. And that's kind of how we avoid that. So we recognize that makers and menders are not rivals, right? In that ecosystem, we need each other. There are projects where people who are rapid prototypers are absolutely the right people for. And it's not like things are better or worse. We need to look at the different projects and kind of look at context. And same with business and software folks. We're not rivals. We need each other, right? We need to be able to negotiate scope and figure out what features and, think about budget. And the better that we can collaborate and work together on those, then the more efficient we're going to be and the better the code that we create. I'm going to go over this really quickly about what empathy is. The past 3 years, I've spent so much deep thinking in terms of what empathy is. There's been a whole lot of new science. So these are some models that I've come up with. I'm sorry that the text is a little small on one of them. But the core of empathy is really that it is a habit. It's a habit it's a psychological term called a reappraisal. And what this means is that you pause and think before you act, right? It sounds really simple, and there's benefits even if you don't do like the full process or, everything. Just doing this is good for your health. It's good for your stress levels. People tend to have better social engagement. They get better support from their peers. They bounce back from stressful situations better. So like just making this a habit in and of itself is so useful, just as a personal habit. But we look at empathy when we kind of put these different rule sets where first we collect ourselves. We have to be emotionally regulated, and we have to kind of anchor ourselves in a self-concept first before we can empathize. It's not about a mind meld. It's not like over visualization. It's not really walking in someone else's shoes. It's really about creating a system where, okay, here's myself. Here's what I want to say. Here's somebody else's perspective. Here's what I'm inferring, and always framing it as like, it's a guess. It's my best guess. It's not truth. It's not a psychic ability. And then what is the best way that I can communicate in that system, in that moment, that is going to likely lead to collaboration, right? So that, collect, connect, communicate. I tried to make it where it's similar to like red, green refactor. It's just an easy thing that you can remember. And then, thinking through like, as a group, as a community, right? If we don't have the resources, then we can't really empathize. So sometimes we find ourselves in confrontation. And if we try to like really understand someone, it's not going to be useful because we really have to focus on capacity building. So that's where things like psychological safety, making sure that we have time to have conversations, focusing on our mental and physical health. There's a whole lot that goes in there, but we have to have the capacity to then clearly think about somebody else. Coordination, I think, is where we live in the work environment. We are constantly just negotiating what needs to be done. And I think a lot of times it just feels like we're bound to our existing circumstances where like, okay, how do we work together? I take the tickets, like the code monkey kind of mentality where it's like, okay, I'm just doing these things. And it's like, how can I work together? And it's not very motivating, but it can be like, and then if you're distressed, you very easily go into confrontation. But if you can learn to empathize reciprocally, like like a lot of different people can learn to empathize, that's where you get collaboration. That's where you get models like makers and menders, because Scott and I would have long debates over like things. And it was because we had different perspectives and we were willing to do the work to understand each other, even though it was hard so many times. Then we got to collaboration, which is where you get innovation and new ideas, and it feels fun. Like when we think about what agile should be, collaboration is where it is. But a lot of times when it's presented as a like methodology, it's purely coordination, and we're just like implementing a process. So that's the difference between like making agile really work and having it not. I'm convinced. And then when we're in collaboration, we don't stay there because things happen, right? And our environments change. And so sometimes there's too much chaos. Like there's just so much going around. Like there's fear, there's uncertainty, right? Or, I just don't know what you're talking about, right? Or there's too much cohesion, which is where that affinity is. So this can be like there's too much bureaucracy, or there's too much, too many people who are like us, and we don't have enough diversity of thinking. So when we think about like understanding each other, affinity is great because it helps us build our capacity. So it's not that spaces, like we shouldn't avoid spaces like legacy code rocks, but we shouldn't expect that this is the way that everybody should be, or that our way is better than anyone else. Because if we get into that mindset, it can cause problems. And cohesion can then limit our ability to collaborate. So the way that we overcome these differences is through compassion, which is the desire to help and care about people, and empathy, which is more of the models of being able to understand each other. So next, let's look at quality interactions. And I think this was where I feel like I contributed to, kind of that first iteration of Legacy Code Rocks back in the day, because my background is in strategic communications. And when we think about communications, we're thinking about things like how frequently should we meet, and what tools should we use, and how often should we meet, how long should we meet, and should this be a one-way communication? Like right now I'm talking to you, I'm trying to, get comments and stuff like that. But it's really like me talking to you. It's kind of a one-to-many. But sometimes we want things to be way more collaborative, like we have in the open space later. And also, what's the purpose? Like, why are we meeting? I think, one of the things that we do a lot is do meeting audits. And, we delete meetings like we delete dead code, right? And sometimes meetings just like aren't serving us anymore. So not being afraid to change when purpose happens. So that's what I mean by communication infrastructure. Like we have to have similar how we need roads and plumbing, in order to just have a house in a city or whatever. We need tools, we need channels, we need kind of this structure to be able to engage. And next we have culture. So I love Edgar Schein's definition, where a culture is really the collection of all of the shared values, beliefs, priorities, and behavioral norms that individuals use within a group to navigate situations and solve problems. And it's shared learning, and it happens whether or not you're intentional about it or not, right? Families have culture. Like there's just a lot of kind of hidden, unsaid things that just people know. But there's also things that are explicit. So some of the, Conway's law is something we talk a lot about on the podcast, and we talk a lot about this when it comes to legacy code. And what this is that any system that's developed is going to be a mirror of the communication system that upheld it, that created it. So because Corgi Bytes was kind of the main driver in the beginning of this, some of our core values have, I think, really influenced the legacy code rocks culture, and their act with empathy, adopt a growth mindset, communication is just as important as code, craft in context, calm the chaos, right? But that doesn't define it. Those are some inherited things. So if you feel like you want to type in the chat or just think through or talk about today, I would love to maybe think about some open spaces around like what defines the legacy code rocks culture, because what do we want it to be going forward in the future? And without interactions, we don't have a community. We just have a collection of similar individuals. So, and I think that in my years of community building, what I've noticed is that there's a lot of people who sit on the sidelines and lurk, and that is great. And I feel comfortable there too. But it's really important for us to interact with each other and share things on Slack and share the celebrations. And we can feel really timid when we do that. And that's where that psychological safety and the celebrating each other, that's where that really comes in. So making sure that we have space to interact with each other is really essential for building a community. Next, we have finding value. And an important thing to remember with communities is member autonomy. If we insist that members are a part, we don't have a community. We have a cult, or we have coercion, right? So autonomy is essential. And that means that participation is constantly in flux. Like, we need to honor that lives change and, people get new jobs, or they have babies, or they move to a different city, or, they have to take care of aging parents, or they're just tired, or they decide to move out of tech altogether. Whatever it is, things change. And so, building those relationships and really honoring the time that we spent to each other is important. And so what we need to do too is to work to ensure that the expectations that somebody has when they are thinking about joining the community actually are what they experience when they do join the community. So in the marketing world, this is called a brand promise. I was sold this thing, and did it meet or exceed my expectations? Or was it like, oh, this thing looked amazing on the pictures, but it doesn't at all, like, from what I got. So, especially in a community where, there's so much easy in and out, that's something that we have to constantly work towards, is making sure that, those are in alignment. And I think when we think about autonomy, like those of us who are in the community building part of it, we build the door, other people walk through it. And we can invite people in, but ultimately it's up to other people to decide whether or not they want to come in the door and stay in the door, and stay in there. And if we're doing our jobs well, then people find value in it. The big question when it comes to value is, what's in it for me? And I'm old enough to, back in my sales day, it was WIIFM, the radio station everyone listens to, but nobody listens to radio stations anymore. And when we look at motivation from a psychological standpoint, there's kind of, people are motivated by one of two things. They're motivated to avoid something, or they're motivated to approach something. So when we think about Legacy Code Rocks, I think we're motivated a lot to avoid that shame, to avoid that loneliness, to avoid that frustration, to avoid feeling stagnant, to avoid feeling like we're just miscommunicating, and to avoid feeling like we're making problems more than we're solving them. There's probably more. I'd love to, hear what y'all think. But then what are we approaching? We're approaching finding inspiration and making friends. There's so many people in this community that, like, I genuinely consider friends, and, like, I will text when I'm having a bad day. And, like, that is something that matters, right? We help each other get jobs and clients. We help each other learn and share experiences. And then we help each other solve problems. And that has a lot of value. So when we're thinking about different interactions too, we can think about things that would help motivate people. What is going to help inspire people more? What is going to help people, find jobs? And then the more that we can involve the participatory aspect of this, where we don't want to just assume what people have value for. We really want to make this a participatory process and learn and actually incorporate the data of what people really, really feel. That's that understanding piece, rather than just standing and going, oh, I think we should do this. So that's why feedback is so, so critical. So fill out your feedback forms, please, because everybody, like, we definitely pay attention to those. So I think one thing to think about, maybe put in the comments, is, what value do you get from Legacy Code Rocks? Why are you here? Why are you spending your day here? And what are some of the avoid or approach patterns that matter to you? And just having some conversations about that. And I love Woody Zuhl's quote of "turn up the good," right? And so if we're doing a lot of great stuff, like, let's do more of it. The last is interpreting signals, and there's a couple things here. The first is around perceived justice. This is really important for a community. There's a lot of research. Adam Grant had done some research. He's an organizational psychologist, about what is an essential piece of healthy teams. And when we think about empathy and we think about, like, high functioning teams, a lot of times we, in psychological safety, a lot of times we tend to visualize kind of people holding hands and singing Kumbaya kind of thing. But boundaries and holding people accountable for their actions is critical, absolutely critical. And this is called perceived justice, right? Are slights against the behavior, are they taken seriously? Are they acted upon? Is it fairly? So there's a few different things that go into that. First, are the expectations explicit? So, for example, the code of conduct. This is how we expect you to act, and this is how we will handle it if you don't. Making sure that consequences are applied fairly. And I think the other thing with the expectations are explicit is what is the consequence, and what can you expect if you file a code of conduct? So it's not just like out in the ether. So this is where that um, that kind of making the experience match the expectations, that applies here too. It's not just kind of in the welcoming and bringing people in. This is how you show up in day to day work. Because one of the worst things you can do is have a code of conduct and not enforce it and let that poor behavior go. Making sure that consequences are applied fairly. So that's where strong moderation comes in. Our group, thankfully, hasn't had a whole lot of need for that. But as organizations and communities grow, the need for that tends to become more important. Contributions are recognized. So I think like all of the thank you, right, slides that we saw in the beginning, and another like thanks to everybody who is organized, thanks to everybody who's participating. And then also recognizing that there's a balance between group and individual needs, right? And like balancing that can be a hard act. But a lot of times when you explain it, the rationale, and sometimes you can't, but that's another place. So for example, picking a time for the conference, right? We have friends in Europe and we have friends in Asia. And at the same time, it's like, we just don't have the capacity to do a 24-hour event where then everybody would be able to participate. So we kind of had to draw some boundaries around what the group needs versus what the individual needs. And then the final thing is called ambient belonging. And this, I came across this in the research around empathy. The paper is How Stereotypical Cues Impact Gender Participation in Computer Science. So they noticed that women just flat out weren't enrolling in computer science. And so what they did was they had a control where they had kind of the traditional setup, and there were Star Wars posters and like just a lot of like signals of nerd culture. And that is an example of like, hey, you belong here, right? It's that like you feel like an outsider everywhere else, but you're going to be welcome here. And with ambient belonging, what ends up happening is similar to the empathy in-group effect, where people who align and identify with those signals really quickly find a sense of belonging. The people who don't, it's a cursory glance at one object and they go, nope, I'm out. Right. And like, notice when you do this, right? And it's so subtle and it's so fast. It can be just like 2 seconds and you decide, nope, not a good fit. That was the control where they had the Star Wars posters, but then they changed it where they moved everything to just plants. Like they didn't change anything else about the course. They, no syllabus change, no introduction to the course. The things on the wall were plants instead of pop culture. And enrollment for women increased significantly. So we noticed this kind of like in how we were marketing ourselves. So the early days, I think the priority really was around like, hey, you feel like this geek like Milton, like you've been treated like a nerd. You've been, so playing into that kind of TV trope that was very familiar with so many people, and being like, you're strong, you belong. But what we realized a few years later was like, oh, that actually, like, if I hadn't been part of it from the beginning, I wouldn't have clicked on this. I wouldn't look like I belong because it doesn't look like me. And it's like, what? So we went to more of a gender like neutral, like, knowing these things, like recognizing what signals are we sending out that we feel might be inclusive, but could be seen as exclusive. So then, realizing that our community really isn't about that TV trope. It's about celebrating and turning that shame into a celebration. And so, and I'm responsible for the art for both of these. So like I was the one who went into Photoshop and Canva and created these. So I take full responsibility. And I think that's the thing. It's like, it's an evolution, and you learn and you roll back as fast as you can. And, you're going to make mistakes with all of this, but you do your best and you move forward. So now it's like, what do you love about legacy code? We noticed that was a thing that we were asking at the end of every podcast. I found this great graphic of like the I love you sign, but like with a rocker. And I was just like, I love that. So, now it's much, it's more inclusive to people who don't identify just as a demographic. It's more of a thinking style. And that's another really important place for empathy is, thinking the same, not like looking the same. So let's look now at how some of these things actually improve code quality, right? Because this all sounds well and good, but how do we actually bring this to the work that we do? I think we can pretty clearly see the team aspect of it, right? I think of a team and, as a community, right? The incentive there is, to make money. That's one of the values, but there's other things that keep people there. And there was some research recently from the Developer Success Lab, um, and found that they were looking at AI skill threat. And so about half of developers feel really threatened by AI. And like, do I have the skills? Like, I feel this, and stay around for Ray's talk because he's going to be talking a little bit about this. But the thing that helps with that is creating a culture of learning and belonging. This is essential for skill development and upskilling. Absolutely. And it's also important for developer productivity and team effectiveness, right? So this belonging stuff isn't a nice to have that we only have in our civic groups or, in our families or in, the places where we're trying to find fellowship outside of work. This is absolutely essential. And I would argue that a big part of our coding, this is the work, because it's finding belonging not only with the people who think about ourselves, but also extending that to belonging to recognize that we're all working on similar goals and similar projects, and we can't achieve a broader mission unless we create that culture of belonging and we're able to, cross divides and learn to collaborate with people who don't always think like us. So feeling understood, right? Code legibility, like, is the code easy to read? Like, that's the first kind of most obvious thing. I think domain-driven design very much falls in here because there's so much about alignment with language, creating ubiquitous language, making sure that the domain expertise, the language that's used for domain experts who describe this is actually what we used in the code. Are thinking about code reviews, like how is somebody going to perceive this? Onboarding, thinking about scope, budget, prioritization. Those work better when we think about what everybody needs and then we kind of come to a conclusion together. Understanding our customers and what they want, and then moving from that confrontation to collaboration. It makes such a big difference, such a big difference. And when we can empower ourselves to improve our local conditions, it makes the world of difference. So I did a workshop recently, and there was a test engineer who was just really feeling, it's called productive conflict. So he was talking, it was identify a confrontation that you have at work, and then we'll work through these empathy models to kind of help figure out how you can solve it. So the problem was that, the test engineer was like, the developer doesn't care because they're not, paying attention to my test reports. And this is another place where it's like, you can see that intergroup empathy bias where it's like testers versus, but you're all on the same team. And so through some of the work around like different biases and like looking at things in different ways, what he realized was actually, no, this person, it's not that they don't care. There's a bias called the fundamental attribution bias, which means that when something negative happens to me, I attribute it to my circumstance. When something negative happens to somebody else, I attribute it to their character flaws. You see this all the time. So we need to balance that bias, right? Because our brain is just naturally discarding information. That's how we go about the day. And so what are the things we need to fill in? Well, I need to fill in my character flaws, right? And then also I need to fill in somebody else's situation. So, just looking at this, the, test engineer was able to see, oh my gosh, this person has ADHD and a really demanding boss. So they probably have no time to read through all of this prose. And seeing that then said, hey, I think I have an idea of how we can work better together. If I recorded a video and then had some timestamps of the places where I think you really need to pay attention, would that be a better way of giving you information you need? how transformative is that? And it's not the top down. This is where we get that experiment, that bottom up. And this is how we lead to collaboration rather than just getting stuck in that feeling that nothing can change. That's the power of belonging. So next we have quality interactions. This is where we're starting to think about that infrastructure. Should we meet remote or should we meet on site, or, do we have hybrid? How much do we, in what situations should we focus on transparency? And in other situations, privacy is important. Do we look at one-to-one communication, one-to-many? Do we do synchronous, asynchronous? How do we adapt messages to different groups? How do we influence the culture? And then, more recently, how do we decide what AI should be doing and the interactions that we can leverage there? And what should we really make sure that humans are doing? And how can we balance that? I know that's something that I'm personally really trying to work through myself these days. Finding value again, we've got recruitment and retention. Like, people aren't going to work for people, especially now that there's more flexibility in like where people can live while they work. Um, it comes to like, why would I bother refactoring? Right? Like, we need to understand what people value and then link the work that we want to do to what other people value. So, like, does it save time? Does it mitigate risk? But having those conversations and using that empathy to really then understand, because otherwise it's a check the box activity and we're going to be beating ourselves and just feeling like Milton, like nobody freaking understands me. Right? When we have valuable communities, we ship early and often. We can balance our maker and mender strengths. This is essential for like creating an open source project where people want to contribute. It creates a sense of collective ownership and shared purpose. And, like we saw in, Kat Hicks' research, it really improves productivity too. And then finally, we have the recruiting and retention. So, or the interpreting signals. So again, recruiting and retention. Like, I'm currently, for the first time in a long time, looking for a new job / opportunity. And so, like, I'm very deliberate about the places where I'm going to apply. Like, if they're sending signals, I'm like, I don't know, right? Whether or not we're inclusion or exclusion, recognizing that there are affinity signals that might help feel like affinity, but they might also alienate. So a lot of these fall into like inside jokes or sarcasm, right? Where somebody else might not be able to interpret it, or using jargon, or using kind of identity references, like we saw with the Legacy Code Rocks rebrand. Making sure that expectations are explicit, having the fair consequences, being kind to your past and, your future self, and also considering, what signals are you sending for the future, somebody else who you may not meet, and then also what are the signals that you can interpret from the past. So the key takeaways that are, Legacy Code Rocks is an amazing community. I think of any community that I've been personally a part of, this is the healthiest and best community. And it's where I personally find the most joy, because just everyone is so kind and awesome. And that's not because of any one person, right? That was the contribution of a whole lot of people. Belonging really is the DNA of Legacy Code Rocks and MenderCon. And so you can use this as a model for how to build your teams, and how to, if you're not leading a team, how can you influence your team, right? There's 4 factors of belonging, right? Feeling understood, quality interactions, finding value, interpreting signals, and also just recognizing like this isn't fluff. Like, this stuff matters, and this is the stuff that improves code quality. So I'll close with a quote that I people say it resonates, and I started putting at the end of all my talks, and it's that we don't code for the compiler. Like, that's sometimes the perspective we have. We code for people, whether that is the person who's going to use the code, or the person who's going to pick up the code after us, or the person who is going, to, think about the revenue generation or the social impact, right? People are at the heart of all of this. Software is social. All code is communication, and empathy is a technical skill. So thank you very much. I have a little bit of time for questions. And I saw David Moore put one in GatherTown. So things of value usually require a cost or sacrifice. If the community is easy to enter or exit, does that diminish the value or quality of the community? In other words, how can you get commitment from your members to actually put skin in the game? Everything feels so transitory and low commitment and thus lower quality these days. Absolutely. And I think that's the thing where you show up, right? Um, a lot of it has to do with interactions, and it's creating spaces and interactions where people find like it's valuable. It's going to be worth their time. And I think the biggest thing is that it requires intention. There is another thing about community building that I didn't put in there, but not everybody is going to be super engaged, right? There's concentric circles. Like there are people who just listen to the podcast and have never contributed to the Slack or haven't attended, a meetup or anything, and that's totally fine, right? But then there are people who are on Slack and they're just kind of lurking, right? And so the idea is like, how can you create value so that people want to contribute more? And it's thinking about things in terms of intrinsic motivation. Daniel Pink has a great book on this called Drive. The research is older, but it was really inspirational for me, where, we think sometimes about carrots and sticks, where that's an extrinsic motivation. But what people are driven by is purpose, mastery, and autonomy. Like, am I doing something that I care about, that I feel matters, right? So constructing your, interactions in a way where it answers that. Mastery, like, am I learning something new? Am I getting better at something, right? So, making sure that, and then the autonomy piece, like people can come and go. So I think there are situations where you can make things stickier. I think personally, uh, there is less of a sense of belonging that is a true sense of belonging, like a collaborative belonging, if you make things too much of a gatekeeping. I think then it can personally like feel a little more like exclusive, and it can then contribute more to that rivalry, where it's like, because there is a physical or conceptual boundary. So yeah, but I mean, I think some of it is that there are things that you can measure. Constantly asking people like, what do you find valuable, and really figuring out like, where are you motivated, what do you want to contribute to, and do you see a vision for a better future?